Hey, y'all. I hope that you guys, as historians, are kind of wrestling through your study for the Renaissance. You're thinking about what that is. So now we're just going to do a quick lesson on who created the Renaissance. And I want to point out we're going to define this word, periodization. Periodization is the process historians undertake to define an era. An era, E-R-A, an era of time. And we know that I, as a historian, identify that the Renaissance occurred from 1350 to 1603. Remember, I mentioned the death of Elizabeth. Really, for me as a historian, brings it to an end. There are other historians that will argue against that. But that's what we do as historians. We create periods. We define eras of history. And it's something you're going to need to make sure you're doing. So today's lesson plan, we're just going to be kind of go through that. And I want to make sure you be sure to understand that no one in the Renaissance called it the actual Renaissance. It wasn't like they were like, hey, we're going through a rebirth. In some ways, it's kind of like as a baby, does the baby know it's born? No, it's going to be told later. And that's what happens during this Renaissance, or the rebirth of Europe. The rebirth of Europe. That's what the Renaissance actually means. The rebirth of Europe. It is the idea in which is defined later. At the time, no one called it. An obscure document of Petrarch, where he referred to the Middle Ages as a dark period, became the foundational detail for historians. It's like the aha moment. A historian found this and said, see, this delineates or creates a line between the old and new. In the 19th century, we're going to actually identify Jacob Burckhardt as there. But he, in reflection, he's the one that actually created the Renaissance. He is the one, and we're going to see that as we kind of go through. So really, as we look at this, we don't know what the era that we live in. I might call it the postmodern era, but 100 years later, they're going to define it as something else. It is it's the job of a historian to define periods, to give meaning to the era. So here's Jacob Burckhardt. Here, I like this image I found. It's a photograph of Jacob Burckhardt overlaid Il Duomo by Brunelleschi. And his key work is The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. He first published it in 1860. And again, Jacob Burckhardt, he is the historian who defined the Renaissance. Prior to this, people just didn't really, they weren't sure what to call it. And in 1860, he's the one that periodized or created the Renaissance. To prove his point, he's really going to focus on humanism. He loved Italian humanism. He believed that Italian humanism was a unique movement that made it separate from the Middle Ages. He focused on the art and literature, the idea of realism, perspective, the use of geometric shapes, the secular nature. He emphasized that. He looked politically, the idea of the nation states. He's going to talk a little bit about that as Italy collapses, the nation states. In his thesis, he's going to overemphasize individualism, secularism. Everything he's going to be focused on is individualism, secularism. He's going to focus on the portraits, self-portraits. He's going to talk about the confines of secularism, removal of Jesus from main part of society. He's going to talk about Ficino and his Neoplatonism school. So he's going to focus on that. He's going to overemphasize the revival of antiquity. He is attempting to say the Middle Ages are forgotten. And that's where he's going to overemphasize. He's going to overemphasize that antiquity. And he overemphasizes the scope of the Renaissance, the size of the Renaissance. And those overemphasis, in doing so, if you read his work, you're going to be like, all right, there's some truth to it. And then there might be some things that you're like, wait a minute, I don't agree. And now I'm going to look at since then, we have this evolution of the historiography of the Renaissance, the use of documents to reinterpret history. And I want to point out, since Burckhardt established the period of the Renaissance, historians have debated the validity of the term. Historians point to Burckhardt's attachment to the rise of Europe as a key bias. In 1860, Europe was on the verge of becoming the most dominant continent the world has ever really seen. We're finished with the first industrial revolution. We're on the verge of the second industrial revolution. We begin to see another wave of colonization. And Jacob Burckhardt, he did, as a historian, I'm like, all right, so he's attempting to identify why Europe's great. And he is going to overemphasize the Renaissance. So again, that's what historians are pointing out to. Additionally, Burckhardt was going against a group called the Romantics. The Romantics of the early 19th century overemphasized the Middle Ages. Well, Jacob Burckhardt wants to create a history to make the Romantics look stupid. So as a historian, I'm realizing that book, Burckhardt's book, might in fact be more about the era it is written in, about the conflict, about the rise, the feeling of Europe, than actually the actual Renaissance. And additionally, I want to point out historians identify the continuations of the Renaissance, which actually made it part of the Middle Ages. Think about it. I'm going to let you, before I finish here with this slide, I just want to think, what is at least one continuation from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance? Think about it. Think about a detail that is similar. Number one, antiquity was important to the Middle Ages. So if antiquity is important to the Middle Ages and is important to the Renaissance, well, that's a continuation. It's not unique. Nobility. We know Castelloni's Book of Quotidiana really illustrated that the nobles still are the most powerful group. Once again, that's continuation. The estate system. Remember we looked at the population pyramid? Still exists in the Renaissance. Continuation. So when we look at this, we begin to recognize that in reality, there is almost as many continuations as differences. And if we do the history, if we go back to the docs and we look at it, we begin to realize Jacob Burckhardt is going to ignore the continuations and overemphasize the change to create his argument. That's kind of what we do as historians. So in conclusion, was there actually a Renaissance? There is, you'll see maybe on the test tomorrow docket, in which there's really not a Renaissance, that it's only an extension of the Middle Ages. Other historians like Burckhardt says there was. Renaissance, remember the meaning of the Renaissance, the rebirth of Europe. What were the traits? Think about it. If you want to identify the Renaissance as superior to the Middle Ages, what are some of the traits that you would add here? I'm going to go with the commercial activity. I'm going to talk about how Hansa really helped create an economic motivation that really sees a great extension. Politically, the formation of nation states during the Renaissance drastically made it superior to the Middle Ages. It brings an end to much of that chaos of the late Middle Ages. Art and literature. The art and literature of the Renaissance, the use of sculpture, the use of perspective within paintings, clearly superior to the Renaissance or Middle Ages. But as I flip back, what are the characteristics that count to that point? And we mentioned nobility, estate system, Christendom. Christendom, though it's weak and it's not gone, it continues. The Pope is still the most important person. It won't be until the 17th century we see that change. So when we're thinking about these things, I do want you to think that's thinking like a historian, putting things in perspective, understanding what the period is, what are the evidence for, what's the evidence against, and we draw conclusions. I hope that makes sense to y'all. Y'all have a great day.